I have been thinking about something, and I don't know if I can share audio with you or not.
Let me
Uh,
see if I can
um,
what I can let you do here.
um,
Um,
Here, I'm going to send you this, and it is at, let's throw this in the chat so that people,
okay, you can share now. I don't know if you use screen share if the audio will pass through or not.
yeah. So I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to share that screen. Hold on a second. Uh, okay. Tell me if this comes through or not.
No
Is audio
audio.
coming through?
No.
Okay. So this is, that's too bad. I'm going to have to stop the sharing. And in the chat, I'm going to send you a clip. And you can just slip this into, this is a clip from Kristen Dumais. Okay.
Who? Never heard of her.
And
You're gonna get me in trouble, aren't you?
no, I want to read you what she said. You can insert the clip here. She says, oh, and I have to find it because she makes it. Okay. She goes, but somebody asked where was the social gospel, and we really didn't address that. There was a long-term deliberate strategy to kill off the social gospel in the history of American Christianity, to divide and destroy the main line because they were a site of resistance, and that has been extremely successful.
You next in the queue.
I love the overarching joy of this room. um, so as a little word of introduction, so I'm a pastor. I'm a scholar of lynching, particularly, but also I'm basically the equivalent of Baylor's chief diversity officer. So there's a lot going on, a lot going on there. But one of the things that I've been deeply impressed with, at least in each of those elements of who I am and what I do, is how important money is. And so Liliana, I think about the questions that you brought up in framing racial resentment and gender hierarchy, specifically the question about Irish and Italian folks, that Black people should just bootstraps, and the understanding of women's place being in the home. Like, these are fundamentally economic. Like these are economic questions. And when we think about even the mobilization of power, it often happens through the mobilization of money. And so as we think about, well, and as one more point, I mean, it is not inconsequential that, like, Trump has a lot of money, less than a lot of people think, but has a lot of money, and, like, really talks about it a fair amount too. And we're propping up billionaires everywhere. So there's the corporate plutocracy thing kind of starting to go on. Where do you see, as we see those trends, and to add I'll drop a little drop of encouragement in there. I think the most important form of solidarity that we can form with one another is economic solidarity, and it's one of the forms of solidarity that I think we often flee from. But where do we see money coalescing? Where do we see it going, particularly in the next few years? Given I think a broader political economy that I think creates a lot of these social issues of isolation and things like that, when we're told that our economic success largely depends on the things that we do rather than the ways in which we may be facing exploitation, there seems to be kind of not only a new set of narratives, but possibly kind of new movements of money. where do you see it going, particularly in these next few years? It's kind of for everybody.
So this is not my primary expertise, Malcolm, as you know, but I want to start by just reiterating a couple of points that you made, and going back to Catherine's mention as well of the extractive industries. And is Darren Dochuk here this morning? Darren Dochuk, professor of history here, right, wrote the book on the subject, Anointed with Oil. In terms of mid-century, and I think what we're seeing now is more of that, right? The oil money has not gone away, as you know, at Baylor, and but now we also have the tech money, right? And that's been a really astonishing, not surprising, but astonishingly important development. And so we know that Musk spent more than $250 million to elect Trump directly, and the question is, I'm a historian, I hate trying to predict the future. Where is the money going to go? Let me also add that I referenced this briefly, that there is a theology underneath this, and there is deliberate organization. Spiritual mobilization got a shout out as well. But somebody asked, where was the social gospel? And we didn't really address that. There was a long-term deliberate strategy to kill off the social gospel in the history of American Christianity, to divide and destroy the main line, because they were a site of resistance. And that has been extremely successful. We also have promises in the Republican platform and Project 2025 to get rid of regulations, particularly around environmental, right, to benefit the extractive companies, and to regulate the tech industry, but not in a particular way to benefit some. I've seen statistics. I don't remember the dollar number of what Musk, how he stands to benefit from just a couple of key legislative decisions, right, that are likely to come down the chute. So all of that, where is that money going? I think that's really important to follow the money, and to realize that this didn't happen overnight. This has been part of a deliberate strategy. And on the theology point, right, that it's not just prosperity gospel, but throughout evangelicalism, this idea of those who are successful, those who have the money, they have been blessed by God. Prosperity and power is a sign of God's blessing, a sign of God's anointing. And it's worth mentioning to those who are Christians in this room, right, how much that undercuts the arguably traditional Christian theology and the teachings of the Christian scriptures.
Okay. That's what she says.
Okay.
You can watch that clip, and I'm going to follow that clip up.
So, in other words, the death of the main line is a result of a conspiracy? Is this a conspiracy theory?
She doesn't say it's a conspiracy. She would say that this was the result of deliberate work on the part of the opponents of the social gospel.
People who work, basically the definition of an opponent, right?
Yeah, but it's not like it was a hidden kind of I don't think she's saying it's smoke-filled back rooms. I think she would point at people like Mark Driscoll or somebody like that and say these people were opponents of the social gospel, or their forerunners were opponents of the social gospel. Okay?
Well, they've long been opponents of the social gospel. I don't think. I mean, if you start doing anything, there will be opponents. But we should back up and say how we got to you and I talking today, because a few weeks ago, I stumbled upon Richard Beck's experimental theology blog, where he had a nice 5-part series on why the emerging church movement failed.
Yes.
And then when I was reading that, it was like, oh yeah, then suddenly I remembered, myself 20, 25 years ago, and thinking through these things and remembering conversations with Rachel Held Evans and hearing about Mark Driscoll and reading oh shoot, what's his name? I forget the guy who the gentle orthodoxy or kind
Generous
ortho
orthodoxy,
generous
Brian
orthodoxy.
McLaren.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
that sent me down a road where I was starting to think about, oh, and because I remember before Rachel Held Evans' death, she joined the Episcopalians, and then there was this podcast that was sort of in the rise and fall of Mars Hill style, emerged, and that was going through that. So then I made some videos about that, and you jumped on Twitter and said, "Oh, I want to talk about this," and I thought, well, that makes a lot of sense because you're the right age and you grew up Christian and you have done a lot of reading and thinking into postmodern philosophy. So actually, yeah, I can really see why that triggered you. So I am, because of who I am and how I'd like to start with your journey in the emergent church movement and how that hit you, how you intersected with it, and if you're willing to talk about that.
There's too much to grab, Paul. Too many books to grab.
Too many books to grab.
Too many.
Well, at least they're all nice and warm there in your apartment in Canada where it's 29 below outside. There it is. Yep, Brian McLaren. Yeah, that's right. Generous orthodoxy. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah, yeah. Tell It Slant. Yeah, I've got all these books. Yeah, 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 yeah. I got that one too. Oh, that one I never read. Ah, I never read that one either. Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. Okay.
Can I stop now?
You've established your credentials, my friend. So please, I want the biography. I want the details. Who were you when you found these people, and what was your reaction?
Um, I there's a book I'm looking for. Oh, we have to get one other thing. There's a couple of other things here that are very important that we need to be kind of looking at before we can get going. And I know I'll annoy some of your people by pointing these out, but these are necessary precursors to what's going on here. And we need
Annoyances
to
are
talk
fine.
about them.
Annoy away.
Annoyances are fine. Okay.
Yes. If we're not annoying anyone,
So
we're probably not doing anything.
that's true. I mean, at least for me, I used to tell my friends it's better to make a woman upset than to be ignored because at least she knows you exist, right? Uh,
That's one
maybe
strategy.
not, maybe not in the era of Me Too, maybe not now, but at one time it was better that she was annoyed by you than that she didn't know you exist. Okay.
True. Orthodoxy
That's
by
G.K. Chesterton.
spicy.
Okay. I've got Mere Christianity lying around here somewhere. So before we do anything here, I want to set something up a little bit.
Okay.
If I can, if I'm able to. These lights are not doing what I want them to do, and it's bothering me. I hate it when I'm bothered. I'm very tactile.
So you're ready to annoy people, but you hate being annoyed.
I'm that's like everyone else.
That's like everyone else.
We all everyone wants to be a thorn on other people's side. No one wants the thorn in their own.
That's right.
I went to Bible school, the Eston College in Eston, Saskatchewan, which is the official school. It is, by the way, fully accredited. It's a legitimate school. I have a bachelor's from that school that's hanging right there. It is ABHA accredited, or whatever the people who followed the ABHA were. It was also at one time recognized by the American Department of Education, which will soon be gone, apparently. In 2002 is when I started going there.
Okay.
And if you know anything about the Emergent Church, it really gets kicked off as a social movement within the Christian culture in the late 90s to early 2000s.
Right.
Now, if you really want to go back, you can look at John Caputo's work in the 80s on radical hermeneutics. And you can also look at John R. Frankie's book with Stanley Grenz on theology, which is, let me just pull it up here. And that book was an attempt to deal with called Beyond Foundationalism. And that was a book about trying to make a theology that would hold together in a postmodern context. Now, that stuff was precursor. As things go, the Emergent Church really kicks off with McLaren's book on ministry in the postmodern matrix. I believe that came out. It was called More Ready Than You Realize, and it was called Doing Ministry in the Postmodern Matrix. Sometimes it's called The Church on the Other Side. The Church on the Other Side, Doing Ministry in the Postmodern Matrix. I'm just going to check Amazon here to see if I can find a year for that book. All of these books are going to have, More Ready Than You Realize was 2002.
Oh, yeah. I had that book too.
Yeah, right?
Still
like
do.
all of these books are coming out right at that time.
Yeah.
The reason
2002. Yep.
The reason people ask, why do you keep pulling up all these books? Why do you keep doing that? And the answer is because I want to make sure that I'm not misinterpreting anybody, but I also want to show people that like Eugene Peterson, Tell It Slant. Let's check the publication date of this. I guarantee you it'll be like 90s to 2000. Yeah, 2008.
Yep.
A Generous Orthodoxy. I'm guessing this is 2004.
So you put Eugene Peterson in with the Emergence?
No, but he was swimming around in that pool.
Yes.
He was responding to them. He wasn't one of them, but he was absolutely responding to the same cultural conditions that they were responding to. This is 2004.
Yeah.
And all of this is Zondervan and Youth Specialties, which was the print, right?
Yep.
This, I'm guessing, the story we find ourselves in, copyright 2003. McLaren's a prolific writer, which is not surprising because he was actually trained in English, not as a pastor. There's Dan Kimball's book on the Emergent Church. All of this stuff was kind of flooding out. And when I was in doing my degree in theology, this was everything. This was the conversation that everyone was having. What was her name? The Plan B woman.
Oh, Rachel Held Evans?
Not Rachel Held Evans.
Anne
Lamott.
Oh, Anne Lamott. Oh, yeah, Anne Lamott. Oh, yeah, read her too.
Anne Lamott.
Yeah.
There was Mark Driscoll.
Yeah.
There was Nadia Boltz-Weber.
Yep.
All of this was all bubbling up at the same time, and it was all responding to the same social conditions, which we're going to talk about. And I think I have a different theory as to what they were responding to and what they are. But that was what was coming up. Yeah. And so
that was the hotness then. It clearly was.
Yeah.
For young evangelicals of a certain age, that was the future.
So this book, which was from 1983, Reasonable Faith, this was responding to the 80s.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
This mixture of Campolo and McLaren, this is like 2006, I think. It's responding to a different era. Yeah, 2003. Adventures in Missing the Point is 2003. By the way, I met Tony Campolo, and I got him to sign it.
Oh, wonderful.
He came to a church in my city in like 2014, and everyone was asking about Emergent, blah 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 blah. And I showed up with this book, and he looks at me, and he just looked at me, and people in the church kind of knew who I was, and so you can imagine Mike's approaching Tony. What's going to
Yes.
happen? And I just looked at them, and everyone kind of like got nervous, and I just did this. And he got the biggest smile on his face, and it disarmed everybody. And they all kind of looked at him. He goes, "That was the best one I ever wrote. That was my favorite one."
Really?
Yeah, he said this was his favorite one that he ever wrote.
Huh.
Um,
Yeah, Campolo was running the circuit back then. I remember when he came to Calvin College and
Look at the blurb on the back. Look at the blurb on the back.
Fundamentalist Journal.
Yeah, give him a blurb on his book. All kinds of little goodies. Okay. So that was coming out. That was all the rage. And I remember going in when I left.
Just a point here. Who gives the blurb on A Reasonable Faith on the Amazon website? It's called A Tony Campolo Classic, and the blurb is given by Brian McLaren.
Yep.
Fascinating.
Yep. There's more than that. John Caputo wrote a book called What Would Jesus Deconstruct? And the foreword to that book was written by Brian McLaren.
Oh, that's fascinating.
Oh, we're going to have all kinds of little goodies here. John Franke was... There was a Journal of Evangelical Post-Colonialism that was done. McLaren wrote for that, so did John Franke. John Franke was also on the board of Q Christian.
Q Christian.
That was the precursor for Christian affirming organizations.
Oh. Q Christian.
Yep, it's changed its name now, but he was involved with that. Grenz, of course, went to Regent and did this after. By the way, Theology for the Community of God. Franke went, as with so many of this, Franke went one way, Grenz went another.
Yeah.
McLaren went one way, Driscoll went another.
Yeah.
There's so much of that, and you can see where the fault lines begin to crumble and pull apart.
Yeah. And that's exactly, and I remember I was talking about Mark Driscoll and Nadia Bolz-Weber saying these are like two sides of the same coin. And I pissed off both groups because, those who love Driscoll were like, how dare you talk about Nadia Bolz-Weber, and vice versa. It was hilarious. But that whole movement did that. It just kind of just went whoosh, polar opposites, even though they were the same.
I'm going to drop this hint as to where this conversation is going to go.
Okay.
Both Driscoll and Weber viewed themselves as having dangerous ideas and rebelling against the mass culture at large.
Yes, in fact, they did.
And we're going to talk about that. And we're going to bring in like this book, The Affluent Society. We're going to talk about The Status Seekers by Vance Packard, as well as The Hidden Persuaders. The Greening of America by Charles Wright. Wow. The Making of a Counterculture by Theodore Rosak. We're going to get to all that. But first we have to back up and say that whole emerging church movement was comprised of people who were reacting to big box evangelical culture.
Yep.
Every last one of them was reacting to the seeker-sensitive thing.
Yep.
They were also reacting to pressure from atheism. They were reacting to they're all in some ways intertwined because it's all responses.
Yeah.
To the same thing.
Yeah.
Now.
Yeah, because new atheism really kicks off, 9/11 sort of throws gasoline on that fire and just whoosh, and the Emergent is really kicking off at the same time, and yeah.
Now, the shift that occurs between the new atheism and sort of when woke kicks off, this will be another nice piece to set the table. We're going to read something that Carl Trueman wrote in 2012. Okay. The beautiful young things of the Reformed Renaissance have a hard choice to make in the next decade. You really do kid only yourselves if you think you can be an Orthodox Christian and be at the same time cool enough and hip enough to cut it in the wider world. Frankly, in a couple of years, it will not matter how much urban ink you sport, how much fair trade coffee you drink, how many craft brews you can name, how much urban gibberish you spout, how many art house movies you can find that Redeemer figure in, and how much money you divert from gospel preaching to social justice. Maintaining biblical sexual ethics will be the equivalent in our culture of being a white supremacist.
Wow.
That was written
2012.
September
Well,
17th, 2012.
Well, that's about so it was so when I look back at my blog, I had blogged in a bunch of formats. In about 2007, I sort of settled on WordPress and I decided I got to stop switching around so I can just keep stuff. And it was about 2012 when I was looking at the Christian Reformed Church saying, holy cow, something is happening here. And these two sides are going like this. And it's about 2012 I began blogging and saying, our denomination needs to have a confessional conversation because we no longer sort of are kind of on the same thing. We're going like this. And that's when I knew we were going to have the explosion that we had in, right after COVID over human sexuality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. If you go back and I'm trying to decide whether or not I want to. Okay, yeah, why not? I did several threads on the Emergent Church a long time ago, and yeah, July 17th of 2020. The Church on the Other Side ministry in the postmodern matrix. I talked about radical hermeneutics. The prayers and tears of Jacques Derrida is another one. Beyond foundationalism, what would Jesus deconstruct? All of that's being I'm pulling that up and I'm saying, look, guys, you that movement, the emergent movement and the social justice postmodern movement are part of the same movement. You can't pull them apart from each other. But there's another thing here that we need to talk about that I feel like we're kind of going around the dark matter of. And that is that all of this, every drop of the emergent church and of the woke movement and of the social justice movement is also a parcel of the counterculture that emerged in the 1960s.
Yeah.
It is not possible for you to understand the ideas and the worldview of people like Brian McLaren or Nadia Bolz-Weber or Mark Driscoll or Kimball or Jones or Paget or any of those people unless you understand how thoroughly those people have been swallowed up by the critique of mass society. You can't.
And the critique of mass society. So if you read Marston's Twilight of the American Enlightenment, all that stuff happens. It's sort of like the Second World War put everything in a freezer because everything had to you had to deal with the crisis of the Second World War. But in the 50s, the things start moving and they really just come to sort of explode in popular culture then in the 60s.
This book is the skeleton key to the culture.
Really? I never heard of the book. The Rebel
Joseph
Cell.
Heath and Andrew Potter. Joseph Heath is a student of Charles Taylor and Jürgen Habermas. He's a Canadian philosopher. And Andrew Potter, I believe, taught at McGill. And it's Why the Culture Can't Be Jammed.
Huh. Interesting.
And this book is an investigation of the critique of mass society. And so, like, a lot of their bête noire is stuff like this. No Logo by Naomi Klein. You cannot understand the Emergent Church or any of that unless you understand the critique of mass society. And so we're not just talking about, everyone talks about the Frankfurt School and critical theory of postmodernism. That's true. But let's read from The Greening of America by Charles Reich. There is a revolution coming. It will not be like revolutions of the past. It will originate with the individual and with culture, and it will change the political structure only as its final act. There's another quote from that book I'm going to see real quickly if I can find it. This stuff that I'm pulling out right now is not I don't believe that culture and government create consciousness. I just see the opposite sequence. Culture and government are the products of consciousness. That is, consciousness creates the social system. That's from The Greening of America. You can already see where this is going to go. What they're after is a revolution in consciousness and a revolution in culture. It's a psychological revolution. It's internal. Okay? And so the view is, I'm going to read our skeleton key to the culture now, because it's very important. The world we live in is not real. Consumer capitalism has taken every authentic human experience, transformed it into a commodity, and then sold it back to us through advertising and mass media. Every part of human life has been drawn into the spectacle, which is itself nothing of symbols and representations governed by its own internal logic. We live in a world of total ideology in which we are completely alienated from our essential nature. That's the view. The solution must therefore rely on reclaiming our capacity for spontaneous pleasure through polymorphous perversity or performance art or primitivism or drugs or whatever else turns your crank. In the countercultural analysis, having fun becomes seen as a subversive act. Hedonism transformed into revolutionary doctrine.
Yeah, when you say it, when you speak it, it's what we've seen everywhere for how long. It's very much connected to the culture of authenticity. That alienation and authenticity, this is basically, the authenticity hoax. Andrew
Potter, the co-author of The Rebel Cell.
Oh my goodness. The authenticity hoax.
Yeah. So the important part, like this also goes back to Norman Mailer's The White Negro. If you've ever read that.
No.
The countercultural analysis is that, there's another guy we need to talk about. I don't have his book. I have it on Kindle. It's Thomas Frank's book, The Conquest of Cool. And Thomas Frank was wrote all about advertising. Because in the countercultural, so we have to back up here a little bit. I'm just going to read something from Frank, and then we're going to talk about the development of the critique of mass society, okay? The most important contribution to the mass society literature was made by Norman Mailer, who wrote in 1957 not just another rendering of Suburban Enemy, but an actual solution to the problem of the age, a blueprint for the cultural eruption by which the civilization of conformity would be overturned. The answer to conformity was hit. He announced in his essay, quote unquote, The White Negro. Therefore, thereby founding one of the great public myths of our time, the earliest and most compelling statement of the scheme by which the over-organized post-war world would be resisted. I want you to be thinking about Pajot and mythology here, because the post-war consensus is not our culture's myth. The counterculture mythology is the myth of the culture.
Yeah.
The only life-giving answer to the deathly drag of American civilization, Mailer wrote, was to tear oneself from the security of physical and spiritual certainty, to live in immediate pleasures rather than the postponement of gratification associated with work ethic. To divorce oneself from society, to exist without roots, to set out on an uncharted journey with the rebellious imperatives of the self. The antithesis to the man in the gray flannel suit was a figure Mailer called the hipster, the American existentialist, whose tastes for jazz, sex, drugs, and the slangs and mores of black society constituted the best means of resisting the encroachments of Cold War oppression. The choice was a clear one for Mailer, as it would be for the rebels of the 1960s and the ad men of the 1990s. One is hip or square, a rebel or conformist, trapped in the totalitarian tissues of American society, doomed willy-nilly to conform if one is to succeed. Unlike the over-civilized man with his diligent piling of the accoutrements of respectability, the hipster lives with the burning consciousness of the present, exists for ever more intense sensation, for immediate gratification, for an, quote, orgasm more apocalyptic than the one that preceded it. Wait. The counterculture, still reading Frank here, Rozak wrote, looks to me like we have to hold against the final consolidation of the technocratic totalitarianism in which we find ourselves ingeniously adapted to an existence wholly estranged from everything that has ever been made the life of man an interesting adventure. It looks to me like all we have to hold against the final consolidation of a technocratic totalitarianism in which we shall find ourselves ingeniously adapted to an existence wholly estranged from everything that's ever made the life of a man an interesting venture. Charles Reich was even more sanguine. The counterculture had given rise to no less than a new consciousness, a way of envisioning the world that was utterly at odds with the prevailing mores of the over-organized society. Under the corporate state, Americans had been trained in the ways of what Reich calls consciousness too. They became automatons, thinking of themselves in terms of duties of workers and consumers. They endured a robot life in which man is deprived of his own being, and he becomes a mere role, an occupation, a function. But unlike their parents, the young of the 60s retained a capacity for outrage, a sense of betrayal of the promises made by the post-war society of abundance. The vast gulf between the official talk of freedom and liberty and the dreary conformist lives of their parents. It's not for lack of want, it's the conformist dreariness that they're against. The youth counterculture was thus the historical bearer of Consciousness 3, which encourages people to pursue their own liberation from the imposed values of the corporate state, to choose liberation and self-direction over the conformity and other direction of the mainstream. That's the countercultural critique, right?
Right.
Everything in society, the society is a system of total ideology, which has commodified everything associated in human life and sold it back to us.
Yeah. And then that critique then gets industrialized and sold back. I mean, I lived in the 70s. I wore bell-bottom jeans. I mean, I saw how many little plastic peace symbols and smiley faces. And I mean, that is this perpetual inversion of the search for authenticity, and that sort of in connection with the meaning crisis, and then people decide that the first there's no there, so then you have this nouveau sincerity culture, and so now it's faddish to be trad, and we just see this continual cyclical inversion between these consciousnesses back and forth. And even someone like Paul Kingsnorth, I think part of the reason it's been so interesting listening to people's reactions to Kingsnorth, because on one hand people very much hear this critique of the over organized society. In Mary Harrington, people very much hear this critique of this meat Lego transhumanism, and both have been captured, and you just have inversion, or people are trying to dig down and get to the genuine article.
Yeah, it's mass society. Back to our skeleton key. Mass society is indelibly associated in the popular imagination with the United States of the 1950s. It is a world of perfect families, white picket fences, new shiny Buicks, and teenagers going steady. Yet it is also a world of complete conformity, where happiness is achieved at the expense of individual creativity and freedom. It is a world in which, as the dead Kennedys put it, the comfort you have demanded is now mandatory. Right? And here we see the idea of the counterculture in its fully developed form. What people need is to be liberated from is not a specific What people need to be liberated from is not a specific class that oppresses them or a system of exploitation that imposes poverty upon them. People have been trapped in a gilded cage and have been taught to love their own enslavement. Society controls them by limiting the imagination and suppressing their deepest needs. What they need to escape from is conformity, and to do so they must reject the culture in its entirety. They must form a counterculture, one based on freedom and individuality. According to Theodore Roszak, society as a whole has become a system of complete manipulation. A technocracy, the discipline of the machine and the factory floor is extended to encompass every dimension of human life. In such a society, quote, politics, education, leisure, entertainment, culture as a whole, and the unconscious drives, and even the protest against technocracy itself become the subjects of a purely technical scrutiny and of a purely technical manipulation. Under such circumstances, nothing short of a total rejection of the entire culture and society will suffice. In Roszak's view, traditional leftist parties, not to mention communists and trade unions, have become stooges of technocracy. This brand of politics finishes with the merely redesigning the turrets and towers of the technocratic citadel. It is the foundation of the edifice that must be sought. That's the foundational myth of American society. It's not the post-war consensus. The rebels without a cause.
Right.
That is it. It is that the society, it has become a total ideology. The society itself has become a complete ideology. And the only way out is to liberate yourself from the constraints and from the mass brainwashing that's coming through at you.
Yep. And so then that then becomes, of course, that then becomes the institution. That then becomes the man. And that then becomes, so, you look at someone like Jordan Peterson, it's very interesting because on one hand, he keeps getting pushed into a corner. Tell us what you are. And one of his more, I think, insightful things, well, I'm an existentialist Christian. And at the same time, he just released his gospel seminar, episode 1, where after the individual introductions, he sort of gives us where he's at right now, which is that the individual responsibility, the responsibility to delay gratification. And that's basically the definition of maturation, and that scales from the individual as they mature and become a father and fulfill those roles. I mean, that's basically a culture of sincerity. I don't know if you've looked at the sincerity, authenticity, all that stuff. So what we have right now, of course, is that the rebels, the rebels are post-liberal. The rebels want to go back to monarchy. The rebels want to, we need a Christianity where we have icons. We need an ancient faith. Whereas, of course, the Protestants all along, that was a game that the Protestants played because they said, no, the Roman Catholic Church is so full of all these accretions. We know we need to go back to the original Christianity, which is, of course, exactly what happens with Bill Hybels and Gil Bilizikian, his Bible college teacher, who said, we're going to have first century Christianity, and we're going to do it in a campus that looks like a junior college, and we're going to take all the crosses and things down, and we'll have jazz, and then we will deliver for you the 4 spiritual laws or the Roman road or whatever it was that late modernity packaged the gospel in, but we'll put it in an accentuated thing. And then, of course, the Emergents come along and say, oh, that's so horribly inauthentic. You've industrialized Christianity. You've mass produced it. What I really need to do is search the cockles of my heart, because somehow, somewhere there deep inside is the true stream of authenticity and the fount of the divine. And it's like, did you read the Transcendentalists when you were in high school? So, I mean, we've been watching this hamster wheel of you know, everyone's revolting against the rebels and wondering, you know, why don't they see my uniqueness with my tie dye and my bell bottoms? Shows how old I am.
But if you watched that, I saw that you had watched that Emergent podcast.
Yep.
So now we have to tie a few things together so
Okay.
that people can see just how thoroughly intertwined and how much of an extension of the critique of mass society and the counterculture the emergent movement is. Back to our skeleton key. In their view, the society had become so thoroughly permeated with propaganda and lies, largely as a consequence of advertising, that the culture as a whole has become an enormous system of ideology designed to reproduce faith in the system. The goal of the culture jammers is quite literally to jam the culture by subverting the messages used to reproduce this faith and blocking the channels through which it's propagated. The first generation hippies did everything they could to violate the dress codes of 50 societies, and then all those things became cool. Well, at this point, the counterculture might have been in serious trouble had it not been for the singular stroke of genius, the theory of co-optation. The repression imposed by the system turns out to be more subtle than the Inquisition because the system tries to assimilate resistance by appropriating its symbols, evacuating their revolutionary content. With the theory of co-optation in place, the counterculture itself becomes a total ideology, a completely closed system of thought.
All right.
There is a simplicity, a childlikeness, a naivete, and a corresponding purity of motive that I have seldom seen since. In fact, this book may simply be an attempt to articulate what I felt I knew during those years.
Hang on a second. Oh, you can keep reading.
Over there, that the glass is thick there. It's not even in the frame.
Yes.
Oh, you know that. Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
I gotta let you know you don't know.
Yes.
Okay.
All of the windows in that building are a mess.
Folks, I want to make sure he hears this
I know, it's just sitting in there.
Yeah, I know.
because the setup is just so good.
Yeah. Okay.
I know it.
Okay. Thanks.
I had to stop reading because this is too good, because he's describing here the Jesus movement.
Oh.
Now listen to what he says.
Oh.
Why did we just talk about co-optation? But all too soon, the Jesus movement was co-opted. And to a different Jesus that I gradually converted. So here's something else McLaren wrote, because I want people to understand he is absolutely top to bottom, front to back, inside and out, a product of this. McLaren, I was with a famous Christian music star the other night, but he told me that night after his huge concert, he had stood in his dressing room, looked in the mirror, and asked, "Am I really doing anything worthwhile? It feels like I'm just servicing the religious entertainment needs of a subculture of a subculture of a subculture." My non-Christian friends are repulsed by the Christian subculture. My own kids are too. Come to think of it, so am I. The hype, the hoopla, the rah-rah. Maybe it's harmless enough. I mean, it's good, clean fun, but better than seeking high in other ways. But it reduces Jesus to my buddy, and it's where it seems so quickly a glib versus us versus them, where we're the good and they're the bad. That seems so dangerous to the calling God gave us. One of the most insidious things is that the definition of a good Christian seems to dissolve into being an enthusiastic consumer of Christian products and services. Meanwhile, many of us can't stand Christian radio and TV. We wouldn't be called dead in a religious t-shirt. We think that the gospel wasn't meant to fit a bumper sticker. Here's another. This was written by Patrick Reed in 2004. This is by Gary Dorsey. And this is, as an editor of the Ooze, Morel keeps in touch with essential people and ideas sparking the movement. Morel is cautiously optimistic. I see so much potential in the emerging church to transcend what has come before, especially when I see the consumerism and commodification of American Christianity. This is, again, this is the critique of mass society. This is the exact same ideology that led to Kurt Cobain sitting on the cover of Rolling Stone wearing a corporate magazine Still Suck t-shirt. Okay?
Yep.
Everyone just keeps on. purchasing all of these books that the system is selling to us over and over again as they commodify our culture. I can't believe they do that. Why are we allowing this?
And then
I would, of course, like to note that the consumerist system is excellent at producing anti-consumerist literature for consumption by anti-consumerists.
indeed. Indeed. And even in the podcast, so when you get to the episode where they're talking about and it was always we were attacked. Okay, so you were your aren't your opponents actually your allies? Because if the enemy is the commodification, what your opponents ensured was that you weren't commodified. Your own attempts at commodifying yourself failed, and that's why. I mean, they don't seem to see the irony in the movement they wish to become in there. I mean, you just watch this and it's like, so, and I actually, and fair enough. So I was preaching on the Sermon on the Plain this past Sunday, and I don't mean the airplane. I mean the plane in Luke. Jesus has the Sermon on the Mount. Luke has the Sermon on the Plain, and Jesus, of course, has the Beatitudes and then the woes. And these just keep sort of scrambling us. And of course, good old St. Anthony heads out to the desert to the cave. And if nobody had ever heard of St. Anthony, in some ways he would have achieved his goal because only God would have actually seen him and known him. But instead, people find St. Anthony and then they're like, real Christianity. I need to go into a cave too, and into a cave and into a cave and before you know, someone builds a chapel over that cave, and you have the monastic movement, and of course, then in response to that, you're going to have the Protestant Reformation, and so we have this long conversation, and you have to sort of hand it to Jesus because here is a sermon that is just going to basically establish an ideal that no one can really attain in this dispensation, and it's going to continue to sort of work through time, and it will mean the rise and fall of the monastic movement. And of course, once the Protestants come along and basically say the monastic movement is BS, then finally, I mean, in some ways you might argue that it was actually Martin Luther who saved the monastic movement from the corruption under which it was collapsing by the beginning of the Reformation. I mean, these things just go around and around and around and around. And in some ways we're watching the newest cycle now with the we can't stand industrialized religion, so let's make orthodoxy great again. This is what we're watching. And at some point, I don't know, I'm a Calvinist, so at some point I say, well, let's just talk about faith in your life. And then I reveal my Calvinist self. So
yeah, I mean, part of some people just moved on, like Donald Miller just moved on to building a story brand.
Yeah.
James K. Smith went right into The Devil Reads Jacques Derrida.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, some of these guys just went on. But actually, there's something much deeper than that. And the mistake is to think that there was any contradiction between market capitalism and the counterculture at all.
Yeah. That's true. That's true.
What they're all doing is they're all saying that there's a system of...
And they'll all agree with what you just said.
No, they won't. What they will say...
Really?
Every one of these people will say that the system demands conformity and that's how it functions.
Yeah, but they're all conforming to the new revolution.
But wait, but it's...
And the WHO saw that.
But wait, yes, the WHO... There was a very interesting documentary on the Who's album, The Who Sell Out. And there's a point where there's a guy in the 60s saying that the revolution will come from you guys. It is your potential with rock and roll to tear down the system, right? But it's more than that. just ask yourself, and just as a way to warm up into it, ask yourself this: what sounds more like capitalism? Staying the same, having the same products, having the same designs, or innovation, change, difference, doing new things? I mean, look at startup culture.
Yeah.
In our skeleton key here, there is, if I can find it, they do.
It's a great title, by the way, The Rebel Cell. That's a great title.
Yep, they call it the Rebel Cell for exactly. Okay, well, let's go. Maybe it's on 260. This should be. So if they do one where they go like compare like the hip and the square. So at this time, Eastern religions were really cool, right? So
Yep.
which sounds hip and which sounds square? Materialism, dualism, mechanistic universe, rationality, technological progress. That's square. Spiritualism, mind, body, holism, organic universe, consciousness, spiritual growth. That's hip. That's Eastern versus Western spirituality. What was going on at that time? The quote unquote the commodification of what? Of what they would call Eastern spirituality, which was like really just a knockoff. There was a book called Stuff White People Like years ago, and one of the things that white people like is religions that are different from their parents, right?
Yes.
Here, according to Mailer, square is white, authoritarian, society, salvation, alcohol. That's square. Hip is black, nihilistic, anarchism, sin, marijuana, right? The superficialities are all there. And you can see what's hip and what's square, what's popular, what's not. And the whole thing is this: the creative spirit, which is supposed to underlie the hip, all of the creativity and the newness and the redesigning of things, fits flawlessly with capitalism. In fact, it's what drives the cycles of obsolescence.
Right.
So,
Fashion. That's fashion.
and this is exactly where I'm going to go, because when Vance Packard wrote The Hidden Persuaders, and Thomas Frank talks about this in his book, The Conquest of Cool. You know which people loved the book The Hidden Persuaders and its critique of mass society? Advertising agencies. They all had copies of it. Have you ever watched the show Mad Men? Okay, because we're going to come back to that final scene of Mad Men. And we're going to talk about it because it's perfect. It's all creative people kicking back against the system. The advertising people. I mean, Avis did an ad back in the 60s that shouted, "We're number 2." Why? Because they're subverting the system.
Right.
Thomas Frank gave a lecture where he talked about how there was an advertising agency that had kept an archive, and he was able to go back through it, because most of this stuff, like who's keeping a list of ads? Everyone hates advertising, but this advertising agency was, and they had all these interviews from guys at the time, and every single one of those people, it was, he calls it Theory X and Theory Y, where Theory X is rigor, order. It's the 50s advertisers with the guy in, our product has 18% more beads than their product, and it has a 14% reduction in blah, blah, blah. And you switch into the 60s and it's like rock and roll, man. And what's happening there, says Frank, is that all of the advertising agencies were completely on board with the critique of mass society. They hated it too. In fact, he says one of the admin told him that the way you sell something in American culture is you find a social convention, figure out how to subvert it, and sell the product as part of the subversion.
Right.
Now, they'll talk about co-optation. And he says to begin to take cooptation seriously is to instantly to discard one of the basic shibboleths of 60s historiography. As it turns out, in many American businesses, particularly in the industry studied here, imagined the counterculture not as an enemy to be undermined or a threat to consumer culture, but as a hopeful sign, a symbolic ally in their own struggles against the mountains of deadweight procedure and a hierarchy that had accumulated over the years. They all agreed with each other. Every one of these countercultural rebels that I'm fighting against the system, and it's like all of the advertising executives were all fighting against the system. Everybody's fighting against the system.
Right. And they are the system.
Everyone thinks that the system is oppressing them.
That's right.
And this is the foundational myth, that there is a social system which functions as a prison by controlling us and keeping us asleep. This is everything from the sheeple are sleeping, we need to wake them up. This is woke. Right. Screw it.
It's also
the
the
hippie
Matrix.
Culture. This is also the Matrix. This is the anti-consumerism of Kurt Cobain. This is the punks in the 80s. This is the Jesus movement in the 70s. This is the guy in this thinking the man sends the fuzz around to bust your stash so you don't free your mind. It's all the same thing. Both Mark Driscoll and Nadia Bolz-Weber are doing the same thing, and so is Kristen Dumais. So is Scott Coley. So is Beth Allison Barr. All of them, all of the post-liberals on the political right who think we're fighting against the post-war consensus of liberalism. And the other people say we're fighting against the post-war consensus of conformity. And really what's happening is you guys would like more order. That's the consensus they're fighting against. They want loosey-goosey, anything goes. That's the consensus you're fighting against. You're rebelling against each other. This is what you're doing. And it creates all kinds of interesting things because you have all of these influencers that fight, and then you find out that like behind the scenes they've all been dating. It's kind of like this is what we're finding out. Like you go, oh, you guys are a couple.
Yeah, because Gavin Newsom's his girlfriend before his current wife wasn't that also Donald Trump Jr.'s live-in girlfriend? I mean,
Gavin Newsom was do you one better? Gavin Newsom was dating Kimberly Guilfoyle. They were
that's
married.
Her. Yeah, that's her. Yeah. You know,
like
and you think
Yep.
So, and again,
like the young insurgents, people in more advanced reaches of American corporate world deplored conformity, distrusted routine, and encouraged resistance to establish power. The articles decrying conformity had appeared in no less august a periodical than Reader's Digest. Daniel Bell wrote that no one in the United States defends conformity. Everyone is against it, and probably everyone always was. 30 years ago, you could easily rattle a middle-class American by charging him with being a Babbitt. Today, you can do so by accusing him of conformity. The problem is to know who is accusing whom.
Yep. And so then the conversation, so then of course that leads to the suspicion that anything that anybody is saying doesn't really matter. What really counts is that they are doing this in order either to gain status or to put money in the bank. And because gaining status usually puts money in the bank, especially in a social media environment, it's the same thing. And so then you sort of return down into, okay, so then where is there a there? And that is sort of where we're at. The difficulty is we had a one of the channels, Christian Baxter had a good conversation with Jordan Hall, and we're talking about the difference between scale and growth, because everyone wants to scale their clout or their footprint or whatever it is in order, of course, to do this. And so then you have the anti-scalers. But of course, if you in fact want to change the world, it's going to require, especially on some timeline that you are going to live to see, then you are going to want to have a movement scale, yada, yada, yada. And that's where we're at now. So we have elected, which is, I just laugh when I look at this drama playing out because we elected another baby boomer into the White House, and it's just I just watch it turn and turn and turn, and so people then text me and message me about this or that. I say this is politics as usual, boys and girls. This isn't really a departure. Yeah, some things might change, some things have been paused, defunded, whatever, but things always get defunded and other things get funded, and we're watching this. And so, is there an escape from the book of Ecclesiastes?
I'd like to think so, but I mean, we need to find, of all things, remember J.D. Hall? Do you remember
Ringing a
him?
bell.
I have to see if I can find it.
The pastor?
Yeah.
Religious RNS. Yep, that's we know them. J.D. Hall, pulpit and pen founder, disqualified from ministry by Montana Church.
Mhm.
In the past, Hall's church, a fundamentalist congregation that opposed critical race theory, has stood behind its controversial pastor.
No, I need.
This is 2022.
Um, uh,
Hall's congregation, a self-described fundamentalist Six-Day Creationist Independent Baptist Church, has stood by its pastor despite legal reasons. After
there
Hall's
is
arrest, what was he
something.
arrested for?
No, there's something that he said that I desperately need to find.
Well, he was arrested for
Because
driving under the influence and carrying a concealed weapon while
yeah,
intoxicated.
yeah, but there's something else that he said that he wrote, and I need to find it. Here it is. Um, mm, there's a very long post that he writes. Um, see if I can find
I should do this on StreamYard because then I can play branding.
it. um, he's talking about polemics, and he says, I carried a lot of water for a lot of men. I was asked after by so-and-so to go after latent flowers, and I obliged. But what resulted was an endless, time-wasting, mind-numbing back and forth that went on for months. I look back and wonder why I was so easily provoked into a lifelong grudge with a guy I had no beef with and don't even personally dislike. The brand of polemics, the type I invented, served as a goon squad for too many respectable theologians who, at the sending of an email, could get us to take the flak for them, reroute opponents, and say things they were unwilling to say. The first time I went after Severus Diabolos was at the insistence of Justin Peters, who, after being pummeled for a video, asked me to take the pressure off of him. And then there was all the cases of collateral damage. When someone is accustomed to using you as an instrument for theological warfare, they take great umbrage that you would criticize anything they do. I don't regret criticism at MacArthur for closing his church or for praising him when he changed his theology on Romans 13, but I regret losing friends over it. Ditto for my criticism for him for inviting the social justice leader to SHEPCOM on one hand while signing the Dallas Statement on the other, but I wish it would have been less personal. I set my relationship with Brandon House on fire on behalf of so-and-so, which was stupid enough. I later torched it again over his attacks on so-and-so. Then I had to suffer the consequences. When MacArthur held Strange Fire, we were told that being charismatic was the single greatest existential threat to the church. We believed them, and I led armies of young Christians on the warpath against the charismatic movement. One figure, John Piper, was repeatedly lifted up as an example of the infiltration of charismaticism into mainstream thought. But then last year, MacArthur invited Piper to ShepCon, where Piper predictably said some crazy things. But I thought charismaticism was the greatest existential threat, and he was leading a practitioner right now, right? But now, MacArthur says social justice is the greatest threat, so I guess the threat of charismaticism is lifted. Prior to all of this, Arminianism was a pretty serious threat to the church, according to MacArthur, up until the anniversary of the Chicago Statement of Inerrancy, at which point prominent Arminians were invited by MacArthur to speak at his audience. I'm not arguing that these issues are not serious, but I'm noticing that men atop our corner decree something as an existential threat, goes so as far as naming names of those we go after, and then after we go after them at great personal cost, but when the dust settles, new books are to be written, new conferences are to be held to publicize those books, and they stand on the same stage with the same people on the same stage they convinced us to hate only a few years before. I regret taking part in that aspect of reactionary controversialism instead of focusing more on catechists, which is the ultimate bulwark against false teaching. That is going on all over the place, and part of it is deeply connected to the fact that everyone thinks that it's the culture. There's always something. Dumas sees Christian nationalism around every corner. And then they did this whole thing where they defined Christian nationalism and named it, and found out after doing a series of surveys that if you take their definition of Christian nationalism seriously and at face value, it turns out that the most Christian nationalist churches in the United States are black churches that vote Democrat.
Yeah.
But Christian nationalism ceases to be, it's shape-shifting.
Yeah.
In that same clip that I sent to you, she goes on about how Elon Musk and his billionaire friends have given $250 million to the Republican Party, ignoring conveniently that of the billionaires in the United States, more of them went Democrat. Everyone is pointing out that everyone else is brainwashed. Everyone has been eaten alive by the system of ideology. Everyone has been suckered into the totalizing ideology of the system from which we need to liberate themselves. Liberate themselves. They need to liberate themselves. We need to liberate ourselves from the post-war consensus. Everyone is asleep. I'd like to suggest that perhaps everyone's wide awake. Y'all just disagree. The Emergent Church podcast that we were listening to, my computer's going to die, so I'm just going to plug it in. Oh, I need to somehow get this computer plugged in. That Emerging podcast had this thing, and it was amazing because there was a portion where they were saying that like the evangelical smoke machines and the light shows was all, sort of this performative way of ginning up emotion and creating a response. And then a little while later, it was so odd. They were talking about their own thing. They said, well, we had this candlelit ceremony. It was ready. And people started crying. And I looked at it and I said, aha, the lighting you use in your service that's not boring and is very different is deeply inauthentic. And that's why people are crying, because you ginned up their emotions. Why are people crying at your service? Because of our deep authenticity and connection to Christ. And I look at it, and Heath and Potter describe this as a positional good. Being different than the mainstream is a positional good. Because the more people do it, the more they all kind of end up fitting together. As my father once said to me, Mike, you are special and unique, just like everyone else. And so all of these people are deeply entrenched in the counterculture. They think that they're going to revolutionize from within. Yeah. And so they reject any solution that doesn't sufficiently transform consciousness. something that doesn't sufficiently transform the consciousness is not good enough, and so we therefore need to go deeper. This also leads to self-radicalization, because anything that is seen to be insufficiently deep, it might still contain the seeds of the system, or the terms of the system, is to be rejected. So you have to keep going steadily out. So you get all of this stuff that keeps going further and further and further and further and further away from the needs of everyday people.
Yeah.
But it's well, the needs of everyday people aren't real needs. Those are the needs that they get from the system.
And, this is, of course, what we saw when people, they pursued their authentic self, and then son of a gun, they had a child, and the authentic self of the child really sort of liked to have milk in the fridge and lunch on the table. Um, and the authentic child, then eventually became the conservative child, because children really should have milk in the fridge and lunch on the table.
Yep.
And so, and I think this has led to, in some ways, when you add in the technological changes, it's part of why you just can't escape so many of these realities. For example, YouTube is all about authenticity. I'm not going to edit out the portions of this video where you get in to plug in your computer to look for a book for anything, because that's authenticity. We're not getting the pre-packaged Michael Young as Wokal-Distance. We're getting the true Michael Young, except you're not sucking on the hookah today, and people really found that to be either disturbing or authentic, depending on where they sat in the culture. And and so I think, so again, I'm heading out to next week. I'm heading out to the UK, and then I'm going to be meeting up with Kingsnorth and Shaw in Ireland, and we're going to be in a Dominican monastery, and we're going to have conversation. And so I'm emailing back and forth with Paul, and he's basically asking the perennial question of what every believer must answer once Jesus sort of gets a hold of them, which is, how should I live? And you can't answer that question without responding to all of the formation that has been put in us, either from the churches we grew up in, or the society that has advertised us, informed us, and stimulated us, and fed us, and all of those things. And so now we're sort of in a personalist moment where, all right, so we're going to have, how many times are we going to relitigate 1968? Because, I mean, I'm old enough. I was 5 years old in 1968. And even as a 5-year-old living in the outskirts of New York City, but not in a suburban area, but in an urban area where, when Denzel Washington made his Malcolm X movie, the bar he walked out of was 2 doors down from the church I grew up in. And it was so funny because when I saw that scene in the Malcolm X movie, I thought they didn't show the inside of that bar, because that bar is basically about the size of a hallway. So, and so at some point, you just have to somehow make your peace between you and your God, and choose how to live, whether that's running into a cave to follow St. Anthony, or being faithful to your spouse or your child, or figuring out how to live in faithfulness to Christ in whatever state you find yourself, usually through some combination of having been thrown by a culture and the messes we make on our own ignorance and folly. I mean, and so people come to me and say, "How should you live, Pastor?" And how should I live, Pastor? And mostly what I do is listen to them, and at some point, based on whatever I have that is true and good and worthwhile, to try to give to them, okay, this is what at least from what I think Jesus would have you do. And
Out of my but part of the reason why we're keeping on with the 60s is because that's the foundational myth of the society.
right.
You can see this in the in the culture at large. I watched this one. Cool is, in some ways, it's a positional good, defined by being, I'm outside of the mainstream, I'm different, and you wish you could be different like me. It's never, I'm different in ways that you don't like. It's, I'm different in ways that you wish you could be. That's cool.
Right. Right.
I have a status that's unavailable to you.
Right.
And so there's this fight. This cover came out and said the Cruel Kids table. I don't know if you saw this. And it showed, it was the cover of New Yorker.
That was that.
Yeah.
And then people showed the whole picture.
Yeah. But there's a different point here to be made. There was someone on Twitter who said, this makes us look awesome. And what's proceeding to happen then is this person goes on, man, these right-wingers don't realize that because they could never have cool, because in order to be cool, you'd have to be all of yada, 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 yada. And they can never perform that because it doesn't fit along with their ideology and worldview. She goes, therefore they don't realize that this aesthetic is actually horrible. It's very bad and they shouldn't want to be like it. And so from conservatives, look at that image and say they've made us look awesome. And the left are saying, hey, don't you realize we made you look ugly? It's kind of like somebody hands you a pair of really baggy jeans and thinks, boy, I made him look dumb. And then you go out to the skateboard park where all the kids are wearing baggy jeans and they're like, nice.
Right. And when your enemy is losing, don't stop them. So if you look at that cover and think, yeah, we've made them look ugly, why would you point it out on Twitter? I mean,
right. It's because wait, you're not supposed to want to look that way. You're supposed to think I'm the cool one. You lack the media literacy to know that I made you look stupid. If you had a deeper understanding, you'd know how silly you look in that picture. And all the conservatives are like, and what's happening is they're both trying to occupy the center of the interpretive frame. They both want to come into the center of the interpretive frame so they can put forth an interpretive saying that says, we're outsiders. We need to control this middle frame so everyone knows that we're outsiders.
But the penalty for being an outsider is to not be seen.
Yeah, but they don't. It's not that they don't want to actually be outsiders.
No, I know. They don't want to
outsiders.
actually be outside. I understand the shtick. I understand the game. I mean, in the CRC, the video I released today was all about my own denomination because the boomers, the boomers won the day. And what they can't understand is why their children, the children that have sort of conformed to many of the boomers and embraced, because children have an amazing way of understanding where the parents are looking more than what the parents are saying.
That's right.
What happened was that many of the children of the boomers understood where their parents were looking. And so when they got old enough, they basically said, why would I go to church? And so they didn't go to church. And then these other people who stayed in church, who actually now are of the age, the millennials who are of the age to start owning the institution, when the vote came to bless same-sex marriage, because that was the continuation of the Christian Reformed counterculture, all of those young millennials said, no, we're not going to do that. And the difficulty was that those in charge who had basically climbed the ranks and owned the institution, they simply could not understand what happened to them. And now we're seeing that nationally.
You see this in the Emergent podcast. Every one of those guys, like you listen to them, they're all talking about how dangerous their ideas are. And I'm sitting here going like, for the better part of the last 4 years, you can get fired or have your Twitter account suspended for disagreeing with you. Like all of these people want to like, and it's kind of like, I mean, they really are mirror images of each other. Like you see this from MacArthur. Everything I remember when Strange Fire came out and Pentecostals were the greatest threat to the gospel. And then it came out that we kept our churches open while MacArthur closed his. And all of a sudden it was like, nobody said, like all of a sudden the strange part, nobody said the heresy dens have remained open. How dare they? Like nobody did that. Nobody used the Pentecostal churches being open as evidence that the lockdowns were justified. Because look, if the heretics are staying open, they must be wrong. Nobody did that. What it was looked at as, the Pentecostals were brave. And all of a sudden, all of those signed statements against charismaticism were forgotten.
Yeah. Well,
all of that went away. And this is something which in that podcast, all of these guys kept talking about how they were, they continuously made talk. There was a cleavage between those who said we need a new methodology, a new aesthetic, so that we aren't cringified to the point where nobody wants to be part of us. We don't want to be glued to and socially stuck with the label of boring mainstream. Otherwise, the cool kids won't want to hang out with us, and the cool kids get to make the culture. And if we want to be able to make the culture, we have to be able to sit at the table with the cool kids. And that is driving huge portions of what's going on. Yeah. But those people fail to realize that the cool kids, that cool is a positional good that exists as a product of our society's acceptance of the critique of mass society. And for that reason, what happened with the Emergent Church, I watched your conversation with CW, and CW put forth the very controversial suggestion that the Emergent Church had abandoned its people. I thought, no, that's not quite right. And somebody said, well, they got absorbed into the main line. And I thought, well, that's also part of it. And then Young, Restless, and Reformed, and those people went back to the seeker-sensitive, but they brought some of the aesthetic with them. And I thought, well, that's also sort of correct. But what was actually driving the critique of mass society was a particular form of politics. And it's the politics of the critical theoretical left. There really wasn't a critical theoretical right. The right just accepted the critique of mass society and said, yeah, but you're the mass society. But on the left, all of that was hitched. Rosak, Reich, they're all hitched. Every one of those people is hitched to a vision of social justice that's equalitarian, very often fully socialist, and accepts all of the criticism that comes from post-colonial theory, critical race theory, all of that stuff is the formalized version of the social justice movement that goes all the way back to the 60s.
Okay, so let's engage CW's critique, because.
But before we do that,
okay.
This is where the point comes out. Remember what Kristen said. I showed you the thing Kristen said about the social gospel. Okay, we need to get this part down because this is Jonathan Rauch. Says something different. Rauch says this: a third complaint I have about them, that's the post-liberals, is that they want to blame people like me, the secular atheist homosexual, for the decline of Christianity. And I'll take some of the blame for that. And I do. Folks like me need to be more friendly and understanding and supportive of the importance of faith to people's lives and to our democracy. But what those guys over there, the post-liberals, are doing is basically shifting the blame to us for what I see as their failures. It was not my fault that the mainline churches drifted away from teaching the Bible and into the social gospel and got themselves politicized and secularized to the point where a lot of people felt you go to church and it wasn't just offering really much spirituality or much real teaching. And it wasn't my fault that in the 70s, starting with Reagan and then reaching extraordinary new heights under Trump and MAGA, that white evangelical church turned itself more or less into an auxiliary of the right-wing Republican Party. Kristen is saying the social gospel was destroyed because it's a site of resistance. Rauch is saying the social gospel is what tore it apart. That's why the main line fell apart. that cleavage is also part, I think Rouse, more than CW, has it correct. So if you want to bring CW's critique in, we can talk about that. But I think Rauch is right. I think Kristen misreads that. I think the entire left has bought their critique of mass society, and their social justice is so much a part of that their politics is the dark matter that holds everything else together. And because of that, they're not capable of abandoning the forms which hold their politics together when people need it.
Yeah, yeah.
So there's an article that I call this the greatest article in history. It's called Environmentality, and it's a radical Marxist who attacks the climate change and the global green movement. And so he says, it's we need a review of the dangers of environmentality in the era of climate change. So he says, there's discursive frames are placed around the planet's population. The practices of environmentality essentially impose a full eco-managerial grid on the Earth. Managing global climate change on one hand is central preoccupation for many government networks, and the apparent urgency of acting decisively to reduce greenhouse gases gives the scientific experts and green NGOs involved in this project a new collective morality, ethics, a common aesthetics, and the production of new scientific studies. In this vein, green globalism motives many to enact beliefs and practices that presume each state, society, and culture must be managed along the lines of a corporate capitalist enterprise. Continuing, as a result, one asks if political agendas are largely what the global climate change science is all about. Environmentality relies upon these apparatuses of resource managerialism and systemic surveillance to produce its governance effects. Climatology, then, is not a closed and certain system of discovery, and it is being challenged from many sides. Like any science, its theory and practice represent a will to knowledge that is anonymous and susceptible to transformations. Nevertheless, the green movement's relentless policing of everyday life, what light bulbs to buy, what foods to eat, what clothes to wear, how to commute, what sorts of shelter to inhabit, represents another proliferation of governance theories. This is a Foucaultian Marxist who takes the critical theory thing, applies it to green globalism, and ends up sounding like a right-wing climate denier. And why is that? Because that entire apparatus only ever got applied to right-wing things because the people who invented it were all on the left. They didn't realize that could be turned around and shot right back at them, which is what you're seeing on the political right.
Yep.
You're seeing this come right back. And so this critical theoretical apparatus goes in all directions.
Yep.
Just like the critique of mass society goes in all directions.
Yep.
Everyone else is now just trying to position themselves and say, you're the mainstream. No, you're the mainstream.
Yep.
No, you're in the center. No, we're the rebels. You want to rebel? Have a child and get married, right? It's all framed in terms of this.
Yep.
The critical theory and the politics. This is why on the left of the deconstructors, not a single one of them ever deconstructed their Calvinist faith and came up having the same sexual ethics as Aquinas. That never happened.
Yep.
Nobody said, look, I had to deconstruct my charismatic Pentecostal upbringing, and you know what I find myself believing? The sexual morality of Augustine was right. Nobody ever says that.
Right.
Not a single person ever deconstructed themselves into the sexual ethics.
But I think that's exactly what they're doing, even if they're not saying it, because they can't say it. And part of what we're seeing with the utilitrads and this movement towards traditional Christianity is exactly that. And the real question is, because you can't, if you watch them, you're not going to be able to know what's at the heart of it. And so the real question is going to be, what will the next generation do? Because again, children watch our eyes, not our lips.
You see this thing going on of all of the, like, if you looked at all of the deconstructors from McLaren, Jones, Kimball, like, even like Diana Butler Bass, Karen Swallow Pryor, they're all married. They all have kids. There's no sex scandals. None of them, or very few of them, are gay or queer.
Right.
These are non-practicing libertines.
I know. We've seen this forever. Look at Barack and Michelle Obama, and look at Donald Trump and any of his wives. And if you
yeah,
were
like
to ask performatively who's the conservative, you see Barack and Michelle Obama. You know, forget Jennifer Aniston and whatever's going on with People magazine, but Barack and Michelle Obama living like Puritans, but promoting, you know, liberty or license, and the other way around. And Donald J. Trump being the family man and his children of 3 wives, and I don't know how many abortions he funded in all of the years. I lived outside of New York City. Donald J. Trump is a well-documented man, but this is the crazy moment we're living in, where Donald Trump is the conservative hero, where it's like, okay, so at some point, you know, every angle you get. So then you're going to say, okay, well, it's all about the decisions you make in your own life. That, in fact, is the true vision of authenticity about what you do. And to a degree, that's exactly right. But at the same time, none of us
where does
pull
that
this
vision
off
come from?
perfectly. What's that?
That vision that you came up with your own, uninfluenced by your culture?
Yeah, exactly.
So all of these people, like, and that's sort of the other thing here, is that part of this is like the aristocracy of self-control. Like all of these academics have shown, like, you know,
because that's how you get a PhD. You don't get a PhD by smoking pot and sleeping around. What you get
no,
that way is poverty.
yeah, the people who do get a PhD by smoking and sleeping around are the people who are so inordinately gifted that they can do stuff. So that's like Jimi Hendrix, right? Like, I'm going to smoke a joint and just play, because he's just so gifted that he needs to be outside the system. He can't thrive. The system cannot contain his genius.
Right. But it's not
That's
scalable. That's not a
that
scalable strategy. So the scalable strategy for success
right.
is, and then listen to Jordan Peterson and he will tell you, the scalable strategy for success is deny yourself, value your children more than yourself, be faithful to your wife, even if she, you know, gains 100 pounds, you know, do the right thing. And the right thing is not a mystery to any of us because it's been before us.
Cooperation and Social Justice by Joseph Heath, who also helped write The Rebel Cell. And what's that first chapter called?
On the scalability of cooperative structures.
Yeah. That's exactly correct. And the reason why you're seeing the people on the left say, I don't have a problem with any of why do we need social norms? It's because, yeah, you are self-selected elites who have an inordinately high, you are the aristocracy of self-control, saying, we don't need social norms to keep everything in place. We'll do just fine without it. And what's happening in the Trump coalition is it's a bunch of people, single moms and dads who don't see their kids and broken marriages, saying, we need social norms. Give us social.
Right. Give us social norms because we really have had trouble pulling it off. And look at J.D. Vance's mom.
Yeah, and so what's happening is the people like, and I mean, Heath does a chapter on stigma, and he's like, yeah, like the social norms are actually kind of necessary. Like those are the off-board resources that people use. Most people, when they want to lose weight, do it by not buying the potato chips. There's very few people who say, I'm going to put potato chips in every room just to strengthen my resolve. He has a very dry line in there. He says that Mahatma Gandhi at one time chose to sleep with naked women and have other people in the room so that he could demonstrate how his self-control. And Joseph Heath has this one line where he dryly remarks, he says, sleeping naked with women who are not your wife is not obviously the best strategy for marital fidelity.
If I tell my wife, yeah, I was sleeping naked with these women, but we never had sex, ain't gonna fly.
I did it as a demonstration of my ability to not pay any attention.
Honey, I'm gonna show you how much I love you. I'm gonna blow all of our life savings on really hot escorts and sleep naked with them and not really have sex with them. I'll take
And
pictures and show you. Yeah, this is a real strategy for marital happiness.
So here's the other thing. A lot of the particularly in the laptop class, a lot of those people say like we shouldn't be setting this up as an ideal. That's privileging. And you look at them say married, kids, not divorcing, went and got an education. It's almost like there's a very particular kind of life path and roadmap that you're all following, but you're all saying that we should not make that roadmap normative.
Right. And so some really sneaky psychologist would say, you know what they're doing? By living a disciplined principle life and promoting libertinism, they're preferencing their children in the arms race so their children will grow up to be disciplined and have money in the bank and a good life, while everyone who's listened to them, they are the ultimate evolutionary hypocrites, because what they are doing is sandbagging everybody else's life while they and their children continue to promote themselves. And you can run that through the postmodern critique, and it's really funny, but it's
I once watched a guy say, a man was like, when your child disobeys, you have to enforce a sanction. And he goes, that's not parenting, it's operant conditioning. And I sat there and I was just like, I promise you, because I know people who are in that world. I was like, there's zero chance that your kid tells your wife to F off and you just like have a gentle parenting time with him. Like that's not actually going on. What's actually happening is that the gentle parents are just sensitizing their kids to social areas and then applying very, very subtle social sanctions for what's actually going on. But what you just said there connects deeply to the critique of post-rational criticism by this is Karl Rapp's book, Fleeing the Universal. This is the skeleton key to the academic world. This is the skeleton key. Justin Hawkins, who was in a band called The Darkness, said every great band has to have 2 or 3 influences that make it good. Right? And he says, like, our bands, I believe that they were what were they? The Beatles and Queen, I think, was there too. These are my 2. And then also my mentor's book, where we have to it's with the trust of a true metaphysics, that's something you can't describe your way out of. But we'll get to that another time. Fleeing the universal, his idea is just really quickly that once you accept the critique of mass society, that the whole system is brainwashing, and then you accept the social justice politics in it, you end up with all of these variants. So you have the evolutionary one. This is an evolutionary arms race, right? Okay. So you can have the evolutionary version of the argument. Then you have the psychological argument, where ideology is really operating subconsciously within at the subconscious plane and controlling the actions of people and motivating them in ways they're not aware of. You get these sociological ways of doing it, where the social structures are determining things. You get the historical version of it, the historical determinism, where we can't help but believe what we do believe because of our historical located or our historical situatedness. You get the racial versions of this, where you have white supremacy or white supremacy culture, or there's a system of white power, or the interlocking systems of oppression. You get the linguistic version of this, where our linguistic categories determine what the possibilities of thought are. You get the political versions of this, the economic versions of this, and all of them are doing the same thing, which is to take the contents of thought and say that these are not products of reason, but rather products of underlying processes, and therefore you can set aside whatever's actually being argued and examine the processes underneath the which are thought to give rise to it, thereby ignoring the substance. And that's why you get everyone is critiquing everything else, and then the actual ideas are getting ignored.
Right.
Anytime someone tries to apply a set of standards, rather than adjudicating the standards on rational grounds, you adjudicate the phenomena and the structures which are thought to be actually animating the rise of those particular standards and the enacting of them. So we're going to criticize the biological or the structural or the political or the historical or the linguistic or the sociological or the psychological, or on and on and on and on and on. And what's happening in all of this, And you can see this right through. This is shot right through to get it back to the Emergent Church. This is shot right through everything McLaren does. Because McLaren goes on, and he's got this section in the Emergent Manifesto, in a chapter on there where he talks about post-colonial theory. The book is, I have it actually here. The Emergent Manifesto. And it is a manifesto of hope, but edited by Doug Paget and Tony Jones. And it's why I still use the postmodern, but with mixed feelings.
What year was that?
Oh, what year was that? We have to find out. I'm guessing 2007.
Okay.
Again, it's right in that pocket, right up until 2009. And
Yeah.
then he goes on and he talks about, it says, it's not that postmodern thought is irrelevant than post-colonialism. The two are, in fact, deeply related. I see postmodern conversation as a profoundly moral project in intention, at least, a kind of corporate repentance among European intellectuals in the decades after the Holocaust.
Do you know?
Right?
Do you know who published that book? Baker.
Let me just read something and I'll tell you.
Go ahead.
It says, having read this diagnosis, these European intellectuals treated the cancer of excessive Western confidence with the chemotherapy of pluralism, and then when that didn't work, they mixed in the stronger chemotherapy of relativism. In this way, the postmodern project is an attempt to weaken Western overconfidence. But in 1999, John Searle, who I've quoted many times here before, gave an interview where he talked about how the Western Academy had lost its confidence. And he talked about how that confidence was weakened. And he wrote that in Getting Another Book. We're always getting another book. Where's my book? I have to find the other one. Where is it? I have too many books.
Really?
Yeah, you wouldn't believe how many books I have just lying around where I'm like, oh, this one's relevant right now. Oh, that one's not relevant for the time being.
I wouldn't believe it.
It's the university and it's
Trust me, I believe it.
Oh, is that it? Searle was actually a member of the free speech movement back at Searle was a member of the free speech movement back at Berkeley. And he wrote he wrote a book called The Campus War, a sympathetic look at the university in agony. Oh, I have my light sitting on it, probably. Well, let's see if I can pull it out.
There it is.
And Searle was one of the foremost critics of postmodernism, and he wrote several articles back on it on the early 90s. So this has been going on a very long time, and these fissures are deep. The emergent movement is like everything else in society where the fissures are very, very deep. They thought they were going to close rank around this critique of the big box Christianity. Ooh, very bad. And what really, if you go back down, there's a deep cleavage in the value structure there. And it's more than modern, postmodern. It's that the politics, for all of their seeing politics in everything that everyone else does, these guys seem to ignore the fact that everything that they do revolves around the politics first. The reason why when McLaren said we are declaring a 5-year moratorium on homosexuality, I sat there and I said, you're going to wind up like adopting the values of queer theory wholehearted because that's your politics. You are fully politicized. There's no stopping point. And this is why every single one of those people has all like, and the main line has dissipated too for this exact reason, because they've all followed the politics first model. And McLaren, for all of his criticisms of the political right having become over politicized, which is probably true. There's a lot of people on the right who are doing politics under the guise of religion. On the political left, it's the exact same thing. And so your audience will often see me as a completely political creature. So let me say this so they can get it out, because they're going to be very mad at me. But they'll like this part of it.
Okay.
The heirs to what the emergent movement thought it was going to be are Jonathan Peugeot and Jordan Peterson.
I agree.
Because Peugeot and Peterson are making a good faith attempt at bracketing their politics off and actually trying to go back and just understand the text.
I agree.
They've said, look, all of your criticisms, Mr. Emergent, are what they are. But you have obviously a political bone to pick, because you apply your postmodern deconstruction selectively. And the postmodern deconstruction can only go so far. The swirling paint at some point stops being a rainbow and just fades into gray. That unbearable eye of Sauron that's looking for complicity in any inequality is treated as evidence of a system of inequality which is enforced on every human being. That eye of Sauron which says any particular instance of inequality anywhere is produced by an external system and is not result of moral choices or anything like of the sort. That's impossible to live under. And you're seeing the cracking and breaking apart of it. I remember when all of these Christian pastors on the right were getting Me Too'd, and you've seen some genuinely horrible things come out.
Yep.
Okay? Let's just say some horrible things have come out. Some things were not as horrible as they were made to seem. Some were much worse than they were given credit for. But when this was all coming out, there was sort of this triumphalism on the left. And I said, give it 5 years. And now you're seeing like Ibram Kendi's like anti-racism center just closed. Accusations start to fly back and forth about people being accused of things. I'm like, in 20 years, we're going to look back and you're going to see that on that whole movement on the left, all of it is going to have been as shot through with infighting in politics as anything on the right. You were going to find out, like when I mean, someone said that we're going to find out the end of the Biden administration. We're going to see like just how bad things were on the inside, but it's going to take till that's gone. And now you're starting to see that this is going to happen with all of this.
Yeah.
You know, a lot of people say, well, the Lord sees it. We're going to see it in the end. I go, sometimes I think, yeah, that's true, but I don't think we're going to have to wait that long.
Human nature is remarkably predictable.
Yeah. So what Peugeot and Peterson and many of these people are doing is to say, we're going to try our best in the limited way that we can to pull as much as we can out of these texts and allow them to transform us.
Yeah.
Rather than what appears to be going on in the emergent movement was, we have a politics which is going to guide our interpretation of the text, and we're going to keep our eye on that. And it's actually that which is the moral compass.
Yeah.
The reason that environmentality article that I read to you was read first to me by Joe Heath in an article that he in a thing that he was at, a colloquium he was given. And one of the things that he said is, he goes, look, this entire apparatus of critical theory gets applied to anything and everything. He goes, but how do you know what to apply it to? He says, well, it's the politics of the faculty which determines that. And he goes, so now that this can be applied to other things, he goes, and now that it's getting applied to climate change, particularly on the right, you're starting to see on the left some people wanting to abandon this apparatus of critical theory. But they're still held together, and they have still continued to accept that original mythology of the counterculture. They're still fighting the man. And people say, and a lot of times the people make the correct observation that they've become the system now. That's true, but the bigger mistake is thinking that they were ever at odds with it.
Yeah. Yeah.
They were moral entrepreneurs.
Right.
They were always entrepreneurs. Vibrant, carving out. I mean, there's all of this in Kristen DeMay's book. There's all of this work about people creating platforms for themselves and carving out niches for themselves and building brands for themselves. And then she did the podcast circuit, and I thought, she actually did the Lincoln Project podcast. Who's the Lincoln Project run by? Rick Wilson. Who was Rick Wilson's mentor? It was Lee Atwater.
Wow.
Now, Rick wasn't on the podcast, but Rick runs the Lincoln Project. And who else runs the Lincoln Project? It was Steve Schmidt. Who was Steve Schmidt? Rick Wilson was the man behind Rick Wilson, Steve Schmidt, Stuart Stevenson. Those guys were behind the swift boating of John Kerry. They were behind, Rick Wilson in particular was behind the attack ad on Max Cleland, where they said that he was unfit to lead, and they had a picture of him, and they didn't show any of his limbs. They just showed his face because he's a triple amputee, and they were accusing him of lacking courage to support Bush. And then they had like his face juxtaposed with Osama bin Laden's, and that's how they won that election. That's how they knocked him out. And I was like, she's going on there to talk about the religious right, and I'm like, you know, like that's the guy from, like, if you ever wanted a guy who was in the middle of the worst behavior of Republican ad making during that period, it's the guys in the Lincoln Project, and you're on there talking about Jesus and John Wayne. And I sit there and I kind of am like, you just kind of, you not hear yourselves or see yourselves. Look, I work for Russ Vaught, who's Trump's OMB director, okay? Like, I get it. I'm not claiming to not be political. I understand that I am a political person. I understand that we're all political, but I deny the idea that because we're all political, we're all blinded by our politics. At a certain point, not all of our pronouncements and interpretations of the Bible are just politics in disguise. And we have to be able to, at some point, say that that the cleavage is real and that there's different views. I'll kind of finish up. Like, I've said all that I had thought of, and I've said more than I'd thought of, but there was an article written a while ago, and I can't remember who wrote it, but it was an attempt to find out what people found compelling in William Lane Craig and what they found compelling in John Caputo. And said different people claiming to be Christians have found both of these men compelling. Why? And try to find a way in to talk about both of them and see if you could pull something out from both of them. G.C. Prado wrote a book, and one of the chapters is Foucault and Searle on truth, where he takes Searle's idea of truth and Foucault's idea and tries to compare and contrast them to each other. If I accept the critique of mass society, or if I accept the post-rational criticism, all of this is just going to be expressions of particular political forms which I am unable to get out of. In the Emergent Manifesto, Brian McLaren talks about having read Stanley Fish for the first time I believe it was in grad school, and somewhere in here is the quote. Have I marked up this book a little bit? And in that book, maybe this will bring it up. Let's see if it's here. This might do it. Okay, yeah. Stanley Fisk said every argument is already interested and political no matter what its theoretical trappings. Justifications are always interested and acquire their intelligibility and force from the very practices of which they are public defense. That is, if both parties could be brought to see that political justifications are the only kind there is, and that this fact does not render argument nugatory but necessary, they might fall to recommending their contrasting agendas for the frankly political consequences they would likely to have, and not for the theoretical purity they could never achieve. Like once you accept that, then your politics can't be guided by scripture. The scripture and interpretations is always guided by the politics, because the politics becomes the ultimate standard. And that's what Peugeot and Peterson are fighting against. And that politicization, that political aspect, is not only what fractured the emergent church, it's what created the corresponding YRR movement and progressive Christianity. It's also cycled those political communities. It's also what's caused their politicization, and it's also why they're now coming like this against each other. Like there's a reason why 25 years later, McLaren is still writing. Dumais is still writing using McLaren. She's still culture warring while saying that everyone else is doing a culture war. And there's a reason why Driscoll is coming back, and he's also throwing his thing and doing his thing and attacking wokeness. And I'm not going to pretend that I don't agree with Mark Driscoll politically. I think he's got the better part of the argument politically. But I'm saying that all of that was already there back in 1997. And it's all because at the bottom for all of these groups is that central myth that society has put everyone to sleep and we need to wake them up. And there's a distinction that comes with, I am not one of the sheeple. I'm awake, right? Everyone since Art Bell and Alex Jones has been saying that. And just to finish this off, because we're going to have to land the plane soon, this is no logo. This is the Anti-Consumerist Bible. In the opening section of this book, Naomi Klein talks about...
You had to buy that though, right?
I did.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I purchased it.
Yes, indeed.
This was when I bought this book, I met her once. And I said, wait, why don't, instead of having like a contest in front of a group of people, why don't we go back and forth? Why don't we let's get a group of us, go to lunch and have like a substantive conversation. And she basically accused me of being like a pawn of the system or some such thing, and responded rudely. And I was like, Mind you, she's a very famous person, so I guess I get why she would say I'm not going to waste my time with you. Like, I understand why she would say that, but she's like,
I'm glad I'm not famous.
If I squint, tilt my head, and shut my left eye, all I can see out my window is 1932 straight down to the lake. Brown warehouses, oatmeal smokestacks. This was the old industrial Toronto of garment factories for furriers and wholesale wedding dresses. I wrote this book while living in Toronto's ghost of a garment district. Many other buildings have long since been boarded up, glass panes shattered, smokestacks holding their breath. In the 20s and 30s, Russian and Polish immigrants darted back and forth on these streets, ducking into delis to argue about Trotsky and the leadership of the Ladies' International Garment Workers Union. Old Portuguese men still push racks of dresses down the sidewalk. The real action, however, is down the block amid the stacks of edible jewelry at Sugar Mountain, the retro candy mecca, open till 2 a.m. to service late-night ironic cravings of the club kids. And the store downstairs continues to do a modest trade in mannequins, although more often than not, it's rented out as the surreal film school project or the tragically hip background of a television interview. The layering of decades on Spadina Avenue, like so many wonderful urban neighborhoods in a similar state of post-industrial limbo, has a wonderful accidental charm to it. Thank goodness Emma Goldman, the famed anarchist and labor organizer who lived on the street in the late 1930s, wasn't around to witness the transformation of the garment workers' struggle into sweatshop kitsch. My landlord made his fortune selling London fog coats, has refused to sell off our building as condominiums with exceptionally high ceilings. He'll relent eventually, but for now he has a handful of garment tenants left. The building is rented out to yoga instructors, documentary film producers, graphic designers, and writers and artists with live work spaces. What does that sound like? I'll tell you in a second. We are all stuck together here for now, caught between the harsh realities of economic globalization and the all-enduring rock video aesthetic. Heath and Potter note, correctly, as a Canadian, that anyone familiar with how social class operates in Canada knows that Toronto is Canada's cultural mecca. And so the artists and producers and record makers where they live in Toronto is the coolest place that you can live. Having a genuine factory loft apartment in Toronto when this book was written was not available on the open market. Toronto didn't make that change on Spadina Avenue where she's talking about until 1996. Which means the only way that you could get a factory loft in that area and be one of those people living in there was to have the social connections to be able to get it. And that apartment was probably one of the most desirable pieces of real estate in all of Canada. But if all of the yuppies move in, she'll have to leave.
Yes.
Emma Goldman, the famed labor organizer, used to live on her seat. Wow, as Joe Heath notes, what a tremendous source of distinction that must be for you. Unlike the other areas of Toronto where rich can buy your way in, you couldn't buy your way into that area. You had to know somebody. It was exclusive.
Yeah.
Everybody wanted to live there.
Yeah.
That's why she called it the rock video aesthetic, because all of the rock bands were filming their music videos there because that was the cool area.
Yeah.
So much of what's being driven is moral entrepreneurship and people trying to distinguish themselves in these odd ways.
Yeah.
And that gets mixed up. I mean, McLaren has this line where he talks in a Generous Orthodoxy about how so many of us believe that, and it also in the Emergent Manifesto, where so many of us believe that your epistemology has gotten tangled up in power. And so the guy that he quotes, he says, this African bishop with a PhD. And I'm sitting there going like,
I know.
I'm like, so you got a guy who left Africa, went and got a Western education who agrees with you. Yeah. So there's a book, and I believe it was written by Justice Breyer's daughter. I'm getting this. It was Rod Dreher who pointed this out, actually. And she tells this story of how she was doing prison ministry. And she was giving like the sort of mainline, very open, hold doctrine with an open hand sort of thing. And it's the interpretation, and we're not quite sure. And we're living in the uncertainty and doubt. And one of the men, apparently a Muslim man, gets up at the back and says, see, guys, this is useless. and she goes on a meditation about why she didn't understand what was going on. And part of what's happening there is a group of people who have very, very regimented lives because they're highly disciplined elites, get to put their head in the clouds with this and have some uncertainty in their lives. The people who don't know where their next meal is coming from and have a difficult time with impulse control, or who don't know what their meal is coming from because of their social and economic conditions, don't want uncertainty in their spiritual lives. They want an anchor from which they can operate from.
Right.
And so what's happened here is that
which then again, this whole class of people would say, see, if we can only provide them the certainty of the managerial swarm so they have ubiquitous abundance, then they would embrace the religion of uncertainty. And except that it's all of the children of those people having the meaning crisis. So
right. And so all of this gets back down to, again, that myth. Every time you trace that, all of the meaning crisis can be traced all the way back down, no matter from where you go, whether it's from meaning crisis, whether it's from the gender stuff, whether it's from critical race theory, whether it's from postmodernism, whether it's from post-colonialism, whether it's you therapy culture, all of it. It's like a giant city, right? The outside is filled with McDonald's and suburbs, but when you get down at the center of the city, the I've been saying for a long time that Karl Marx philosophy is the abandoned Colosseum that lies at the center of the city of radical leftist thought.
Hmm.
And when that Colosseum, like when the Roman Colosseum was filled, it was the center of Roman life. And then when it got abandoned, all of its parts were harvested, or many of them were harvested to build the surrounding areas. And then
Right.
you have this outside edge around it. And so you have a meaning crisis, right? You have this meaning crisis that's sitting on the edge with all of these Burger Kings. But then whether you start with LGBTQ and the fight about that, or the fight about aesthetics in the emergent church, or the fight about Calvinism in the right, you go back a little bit, and you find what? You find that's the anti-consumerism, and then you go in a little bit, and no matter what you do, no matter where you start on the outside edge of this, you come back and you find in the middle that sort of post-rational criticism and that critique of mass society. It sits at the center of all of this. Now, nobody straightforwardly buys the critique of mass society now. Nobody look around and says, look, we've all been duped and controlled by advertising. But that basic idea has been, what can I say? The materials of that basic idea have been used to create all of the other stuff around us. So you have, instead of advertisers, it's a system of white supremacy, or it's a system of patriarchy, or it's a system of gender, or it's colonialism, or it's yada, 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 or it's the post-war consensus. And you find all of it. And at the center of all of it is we've all been brainwashed. And the thing is, all of those both analyses and prescriptions have in common that they are entirely immanent. There's nothing transcendent about them because it locates all of the problems within the immanent structures of our society, and therefore all of the solutions are entirely immanent as well. There is no transcendent thing to reach for outside, and there's no transcendent standard which judges us. There's nothing transcendent. It's all entirely immanent. So the problems are created by our structuring of society and by historical things and by a world which is infinitely malleable, and we can fix it. The mess is fixable by us. Right. Entirely fixable by us. It's entirely immanent.
Yep.
And when you take a bunch of people who are broken and can't find meaning and say everything is all purely immanent anyway, they begin to sound like Ecclesiastes, and they start saying, well, why bother doing anything at all?
Right. Yep.
And that's where your meaning crisis comes from. But that central myth, the central myth of American society is not the post-war consensus. The central myth of American society is the critique of mass society, which says that everything is about conformity and the way around it, and the way to find truth and meaning is through creative revolution or revolution of some kind, a breaking free of the conformity, and an escape from the system of total ideology which is brainwashing you. And that basic structure is reiterated across every single one of these disciplines, and you trace them back, that lies at the center.
Yeah. I agree. I believe you. And I also agree that this is why the Peterson-Peugeot thing surfaced, and where the hunger is. And no, that's what I saw when I started looking at the emergent stuff. And it was like, because I had just simply forgotten about it. And then it was like, oh, well, now the why of that makes sense. That's how that fits into the narrative. No, I agree. But I got to land the plane, my friend.
Yeah.
I got to land the plane.
Yeah.
But I appreciate you. Wanting to talk about the emergence. And again, I figured just by virtue of your age and by virtue of your interest, oh yeah, he's exactly the right age to have read all those books. And exactly,
I had an interaction on Twitter with Brian McLaren once.
Really?
Where I told him, I was like, I'm on the opposite of him end politically, but he doesn't understand how, in certain ways, he's like a. I said, when every band needs influences, he's kind of like a shadow influence, whether he wants to be or not, because I had to react to him, and so I said that, and I said, what did I say to him? I said something about how I was like, I've disagreed with you, but at the very least, your books, I did have to think about them. And he said, I wish that more Christians could disagree like we just did. And I was like, yeah, that'd be kind of nice.
Yeah.
But, but, but that's not the world we live in. Anyway, if you want to like land the plane, now you can like.
Well, let me ask you a question because there's something I wonder. How do you keep your notes? Do you use Evernote or a program? Because you seem to have a pretty good handle on that.
Notes?
Besides, I should not. No, you seem to have something on your computer. Or do you? Oh, okay. All right.
I have a Kindle.
Okay. Okay.
I have a Kindle, then I have Kindle highlights. I have stuff that's pulled up. Um, I sometimes will use like AI to find quotes that I have written down like in various places.
Yeah.
Like a lot of this stuff is distributed out through like Substacks I've written or stuff that I've
Okay.
put down, or I'll like have like all of these papers written on my computer. But I don't know exactly what I'm gonna say, which is why as we were going through, I was like, we need this book and we need to pull this book out. And wait, we need to find this because a lot of it is so much of this stuff is completely. Spencer Clavin had a great line on your on your guys' conversation. It's not just because he said it with his deep, rich baritone. He said we're entering the age of the generalist. I don't know, and I've read a lot of my people who dislike me. I've read a lot of them. I am at least competent, and I at least have some understanding of where they're coming from. And I have read new historicists and pragmatists, and I know who Greenberg was, and I've read Derrida and Foucault, and I've read some Stanley Fish, and so I understand where those people come from. I've read Horkheimer and Adorno and Marcuse. I don't know anybody who's outside of that realm who has read all of those people, then has also read like Potter and Heath and John Searle. And so I'm not just aware of what they write. I understand it. And I think I understand it in many cases as well as they do, but I think they misunderstand where they are. They're like, I once played hockey, and I play hockey in Canada. Everyone plays hockey. We play beer league hockey or church league hockey. And every once in a while, like you get a church league group, and it's like normally rather guys, and you get like a AAA player that shows up. So you have like outdoor league kids, and then you have B, C, B, A, double A, and then triple A. The kids from triple A, the really great ones, get drafted to junior B. Then they go to junior A, and the really great kids from the WHL get drafted to the NHL where they sit on the farm teams, and then those kids go NHL.
Right.
So you get these guys from like who played triple A, and they think they can just dominate the game. I think they're better than other people, but they'll take like a 4-minute shift rather than 45 seconds. And they think, well, I'm just so much better. I'm just messing with you guys. That's what they think of themselves as. And sometimes, I mean, they're better than me. Like they are. But they sometimes will like they can cost people a game because they get out of position and think they get back and they can't. So one day we had a guy show up at our church league game. And this guy, I think, played like 13 games in the NHL or something like this. Like, played 22 games. He had a cup of tea with like the LA Kings or something in the 90s. And he was kind of like moseying around. And he goes like, if you think of an NHL rink, here's one net, here's the other net. You have this red line here. You got a blue line, red line, blue line. It's like a 200-foot rink. Okay, so it's 100 feet to the red line approximately, and then approximately 100 feet to the other goal. And so it's like 60 feet to the blue line. And this guy's below the faceoff circle, so he's like 60 feet away from the blue line, and he's out of position. And there's a turnover, and so you get two guys breaking away to our own net with nobody there in front of them. And they're at our blue line, at their own blue line, And between this blue line, this red line, this blue line, and our goalie, there's nobody. They have 140 feet of open ice, man. And they're taking off. And this guy is like behind the net, like down here. And our goalie's up here, and they're skating this way, and he's behind the net. They've crossed the blue line. He gets out from behind the net, and he takes off. I swear he got fired out of a cannon. He caught them at the red line, turned around, lifted the stick, pulls the puck, is coasting backwards, not even skating, coasting backwards and putting distance between them as they're sprinting at top speed. Snaps a shot, puts a pass right on one of our guys' tape, drifts back, takes 2 strides, passes them on the way back, and lines it back in his spot effortlessly. And all of us are just like, okay. 13 games. That's what he was able to get in the NHL with 13 games. And I have never seen a guy like 9 strides. Like they had to go from the blue line here to the red line. It's like 35 or 40 feet. He was behind the net, touches them at the red line, turns around, and as he's skating backwards, just lightly fires a shot without thinking, like a 100-foot pass onto a guy's tape. Like a hockey stick is this wide. That's the target he hit. And we're all looking like, okay, this is on a different level. I mean, he's the kind of guy, you know, like, he's like just casually like stepping across the blue line, and like someone will have a puck. Sometimes the puck will be like sitting on like a board, and it'll be sitting like sideways on the board. And he'll like from the center of the ice just casually like knock that off of the boards with another puck, just casually like. And he's like, I could only make 13 games. You're sitting there just like, geez. I think there's an awful lot of people that think that when they talk to lay people, they're the NHLer.
Yeah.
And they're really the AAA kid.
Yeah.
It's like if they keep their positioning and play their position, they will be the best player on the ice if they in their one particular area. But they can't skate around the ice and skate circles around people, and they ought not to be looking out down their nose. Like I've seen some AAA guys look down their nose at people, and then you have NHLers show up and they're not like that at all. Because the NHL guy is secure in who he is and what he is. Like he knows I made it to the show. Those 13 games probably paid for that guy's retirement. Okay? And they treat people very differently. And I think that's something that Peugeot and Peterson and Oz Guinness and all of those guys who are in that seminar, they all kind of have that. None of them are like the AAA guy who's getting out of position, just thinks he's better than everyone else.
Yeah.
They're like the NHL guy who like every once in a while gets out of position, but it's okay because I will catch you before you cross the red line anyway. And slap a puck on your stick and have a laugh. And I'm not going to take any shots on goal because I'll score every time I do. So I'll just pass so everyone can have fun. And I'm here because I'm being social with everybody and trying to play along and get along and get my legs moving. And I'm just having fun.
They're understanding a different game, and they understand that the other game is actually more important than the game that everyone else thought that they should be playing or thought they were playing. So I get it.
We showed up. Some guys were showing up there to win and in this church hockey league tournament, and he was showing up because he wanted to just have fun with people.
That's right. That's right. He loved the game and he likes people, and it was going to be a good time. I got some people playing a game in a room that they're not really playing a game. They're doing a thing, but I should go in there and as a good pastor, just thank them for doing the thing that they're doing for some other person who needs a thing done for them. And that is
mostly what pastoring is.
that is most of what pastoring is. It's indeed true. So it's great to see you again, my friend. You should. I'm going to try and talk CW into doing a conversation with you. It would be fun to listen to you two talk. But
I think CW also understands the game that's bigger than the game. I think he's enigmatic, to say the least. But he's operating at a very high level of abstraction.
Yeah.
In a way that I was actually really impressed by him. I was like, when he started talking about the various elements of the emergent church and how things were moving through the emergent church. And there are certain other guys who like lampshading their support for particular doctrines. And he's like,
Yeah.
look, we're at a level of abstraction before he's operating at a level of a pre-doctrinal level of abstraction. Like, what are the conditions for all of your doctrinal positioning to be even taking place before we even talk about doctrinal positioning? Why are there doctrinal positions to begin with, and what produced those? And I sat and I thought, this guy's really smart. Why did he have to leave the corner? I
Oh,
want to see.
yeah,
Or
no, and
him.
I hope CW has more people on. But I mean, to me, again, the game here is enjoying the people. Like I love that story you just told, because the truth is that hockey's a great sport. It's a great sport, but people are greater. So
Yeah.
sorry, and I hope I don't want to offend the poor beleaguered nation of Canada in your moment of desperation, but uh, God bless Canada.
God help Canada.
All right,
Thank you, my
Michael.
friend. It was good to speak with you again. I
Good to
always
see you
like to
again.
hear you and see you. And yeah, we'll connect again sometime.
All right, sounds good. Take care.
Have a good one.
Bye bye.